4 people ever spoke about what happened in that alley. One of them refused to give his name. Another moved to a different country the following year. The third swore on his father's grave that what he witnessed that night in Hong Kong's Kowloon district was not something that belonged in the world of ordinary men. The fourth man, the one who organized the whole thing, never spoke again at all. Not because he couldn't, because he was ashamed. This is the story they buried. The night 12 men with weapons cornered the most dangerous human being alive. The night they found out, too late, exactly what that meant. The city never slept. Hong Kong in the early 70s was a pressure cooker, a million lives packed into concrete towers that scraped the Pearl River sky, streets that smelled of fish sauce and motor oil and money changing hands in the dark. The harbor glittered. The alleyways did not. Bruce Lee had returned home. Not as a boy this time, not as the scrappy kid from the Kowloon streets who used to fight for pocket change. He came back as something the city hadn't seen before. A man who had conquered Hollywood, who had made the world sit up and look at a Chinese face on screen and feel something they couldn't name. The triads noticed. They always noticed. There was a man in those days. His name doesn't matter now, though some who know the story call him simply Big Dragon, the loose English translation of a nickname that followed him from Shanghai to Macau to the narrow streets of Tsim Sha Tsui. He ran protection rackets, film industry connections, and a crew of enforcers who were known across 3 territories for their particular enthusiasm for violence. Big Dragon had a business proposition for Bruce Lee. He wanted a piece of the film, a financial stake in what was coming, a name in the credits, and a percentage of the back end. In those circles, it wasn't a request. It was an announcement of ownership. Bruce sent back a single response through the mutual contact who'd carried the message. No. Just that. No. The contact, to his credit, tried to soften it. Maybe there was room to negotiate. Maybe a smaller percentage. Maybe a courtesy meeting, just to talk, just to show respect. Bruce's answer didn't change. The meeting was set anyway. Not the kind of meeting Bruce agreed to, the other kind. It was a Thursday night, late, the hour when the restaurants begin pulling their tables in and the last of the evening crowd thins out into the side streets. Bruce had been to a dinner in Mong Kok with 2 friends, both of them connected to the film industry in minor ways, neither of them fighters. The dinner ran long. Stories were told. Tea was refilled 4 times. The walk back to where the car was parked took them through a neighborhood Bruce knew from childhood. The kind of place where the streetlights are spaced far apart and the buildings lean toward each other overhead like they're keeping secrets. He noticed them at the first corner. Not all 12, just 2. Standing in that particular way that men stand when they are trying to look casual and failing completely. Bruce didn't slow his pace. His eyes moved, not with anxiety, not with fear, with the quiet mechanical focus of a man whose entire life had trained him to read a room, read a body, read an intention before it became an action. He told his friends to wait. They didn't understand. They started to ask a question. He said it again. Softer this time. Wait, here. Then he turned the corner. They were arranged deliberately. That was the first thing. 12 men in a space roughly 20 meters long, a service alley between 2 restaurant supply warehouses. Crates stacked on one side, a locked gate at the far end, one narrow entrance, the one Bruce had just walked through. Big Dragon wasn't there himself. Men like Big Dragon never are. But his lieutenant was, a tall, wide figure known in those circles as a former Thai boxer who had fought professionally before his nose was broken so many times that the cartilage had essentially given up. He stood at the center of the group, arms crossed, wearing a jacket despite the heat. He had a chain looped around his right fist, casually, almost decoratively, the way a man wears jewelry when he wants you to understand it isn't jewelry at all. The others had weapons of varying elaborateness. Wooden batons, metal rods, One had what appeared to be a length of heavy rope with something weighted at the end. Two carried knives, not dramatically raised, just held at the thigh, blades outward, the body language of men who have done this before. 12 of them. One of him. Bruce Lee stopped walking. He looked at the scene the way a chess player looks at a board, not panicked, not impressed, simply reading, calculating distances, counting bodies, assessing reach, position, the gap between each man, the locked gate behind them, the crates to his left, the entrance behind him that he had no intention of using. Because here is what most people never understood about Bruce Lee, what the films only partially captured, what the legends only partially explain. He didn't train to survive violence. He trained to end it. Fast, total, surgical termination of threat. Not self-defense in the way most people understand the term, something colder, something that had been forged over 20 years of obsessive, near-religious dedication to the science of what the human body can do and, more critically, what it cannot withstand. The lieutenant spoke first. He told Bruce why they were there, the proposition again, the terms again, delivered now not through a neutral intermediary but at the end of a chain wrapped around a fist in a locked alley with 11 other bodies positioned to eliminate every practical exit. Bruce didn't respond immediately. He looked at the man. Then he looked, slowly and deliberately, at each person in the alley, one by one. Not a performance, not a stare-down for show, something that the men present would later describe, in the rare moments they discussed it at all, as almost clinical, as if you were seeing each of them not as a threat, but a problem to be solved. Then he said, very quietly, "You should have brought more." What happened next occurred in approximately 45 seconds. Those who were there disagree on certain details, not because they weren't watching, but because the human eye and the human brain are not built to process what they witnessed at the speed it happened. The lieutenant moved first, because he was the professional, because he had the weapon already in his hand, because he had done this many times, and his body operated on the confidence of that experience. He swung the chain. Bruce wasn't there. This is the part the men tried to explain afterward and couldn't. Not that Bruce dodged. They understood dodging. This was something else. A movement so economical, so precisely timed, that it seemed less like reaction and more like prediction, as if Bruce had already calculated the swing before it began and simply declined to occupy the space it would pass through. The chain hit crates. In the same motion, and witnesses are emphatic that it was the same motion, not a sequence, but a single flowing action. Bruce's right hand had already connected with the lieutenant's throat. Not a punch, a strike. The distinction matters enormously to anyone who has studied what Bruce Lee was. A punch is power delivered forward. A strike is power delivered through the surface, into the structure beneath, targeting not the skin but the mechanism, the throat, the trachea, the involuntary shutdown of air. The lieutenant folded. He didn't fall dramatically. He folded, knees first, then forward, hands going instinctively to his throat, the chain clattering, free and skidding across wet stone. 3 seconds had passed. The remaining 11 men, and here is the moment the witnesses say the temperature of the alley changed, looked at each other. Here is what they expected. A fight, a message sent through injury, a man who might struggle, who might land a blow or two before numbers overwhelmed him, who would ultimately end up on the ground understanding what the conversation had been all about. Here is what they did not expect: to feel afraid. Not of a weapon, not a firearm or a blade, things they understood, things that operated within the comprehensible vocabulary of street violence. They felt afraid of him, of the way he stood in the aftermath of what he'd just done, unchanged, unhurried, breathing normally, eyes already moving to the next problem. 2 of them came together, side by side, batons raised, the instinct of men trained to understand that numbers compress individual advantage. Bruce moved between them. Not around, between. The word witnesses used was always through, as if he passed through the space they occupied before their bodies had registered that the space was being passed through. One baton came down on empty air. The other arm was redirected, not blocked in the classical sense, but redirected, the momentum invited to continue in a direction that served Bruce rather than his attacker.
carrying his own body into a rotation that ended with his shoulder against a crate wall, and something in that shoulder making a sound shoulders are not meant to make. The baton clattered. The man went to his knees. 8 seconds. This is where the story becomes difficult to tell in linear terms, because what followed did not proceed in a linear way. What followed was what happens when a man trained in Jeet Kune Do, in the philosophy of using no fixed way as way, no limitation as limitation, meets a group of men whose entire fighting experience has been built around numerical advantage and the psychological power of weapons. The weapons weren't working, the numbers weren't working, and every second that passed without Bruce Lee falling was a second in which 12 became 11, became 9, became 7, and the men still standing were doing a rapid and terrifying recalculation of exactly what kind of situation they were in. One of the knife carriers, the braver of the two, or perhaps simply the one whose fear expressed itself as aggression, rushed from the right. What Bruce did next, the fourth witness described years later in a private conversation that was later retold third hand and probably lost some precision in the transmission, but the core of it remained. Bruce took the knife. Not metaphorically, he took it. From a moving man, in the dark, in a cramped alley, against forward momentum and trained intention. The movement that accomplished this was later identified by people who studied Bruce's documented techniques as a variation of a classical Wing Chun intercept combined with something that had no classical name at all, something Bruce had developed himself in years of private experimentation. A movement that used the attacker's wrist as a hinge and the knife's own grip as the mechanism of its removal. The man stared at his empty hand. Bruce placed the knife on top of a nearby crate. He didn't use it. He never used it. That detail, more than any other, is the one that followed the story through the years, that he took the weapon not to wield it, but to remove it from the equation, because he didn't need it, because he never needed it.
The knife sat on the crate. Nobody touched it. Not because they couldn't reach it, because something had shifted in that alley, something invisible but absolute, the way pressure shifts before a storm breaks. And the men still standing understood, in whatever wordless part of the brain processes raw survival information, that picking up that knife would not help them. Nothing was going to help them. There were 6 left on their feet. The others were down, not dead, not even all unconscious, but removed, neutralized. Each one taken apart with the specific, almost bureaucratic efficiency of a man working through a checklist rather than fighting for his life. No wasted movement, no emotion, no hesitation between one problem and the next. 6 men with weapons, 1 man with nothing. And the 6 were backing up. This is the part no one talks about when they tell stories of legendary fighters. Not the strikes, not the speed, not the moments that can be described in clean cinematic terms. The part no one talks about is the sound. The alley had a sound now that it hadn't had 60 seconds ago, a breathing sound, ragged, collective, the sound of men whose confidence has been surgically removed and replaced with something they didn't have vocabulary for. The scrape of feet on wet stone, moving backward, the small, involuntary sounds of men in pain on the ground around them. And beneath all of it, beneath everything, silence from Bruce Lee. He hadn't spoken since those 4 words at the beginning. He hadn't needed to. One of the 6 made a decision, not a brave one, but an honest one. He dropped his baton. The metal rang against the stone like a bell. He stepped back against the wall and put his hands at his sides, palms forward, the universal posture of a man who has exited the conversation. The man next to him followed a half-second later, then a third. 3 remaining, still holding weapons, still calculating. The human mind is extraordinary in its capacity for optimism under catastrophic conditions. Some part of these 3 was still running numbers, still looking for the angle, still believing that the right combination of timing and positioning might produce a different outcome than the one the alley had been producing for the last minute and a half. Bruce took 1 step forward, just 1. All 3 dropped their weapons simultaneously. What followed was not what the men expected. They expected punishment, continuation, Bruce moving through the remaining bodies the way he'd moved through the others, finishing what the situation had started. He stopped. He stood in the center of the alley,
surrounded by downed men, discarded weapons, the wreckage of what had been a very organized and very confident operation, and he looked at the men still standing. Then he looked at the men on the ground. He walked to the lieutenant, who was still on his knees, still dealing with the aftermath of the thright strike, still breathing in the careful way a man breathes when he has been reminded that breathing is not automatic, that it is a function the body performs with machinery that can be interrupted. Bruce crouched down. He looked at him for a long moment, not with contempt, not with triumph. The witnesses struggled to name what was in his face. The closest one of them came years later was this. He looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has just learned something the hard way. Then Bruce stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked back to the entrance of the alley. He paused at the corner. Without turning around, he spoke. His voice carried in the silence the way voices do when everything else has gone completely quiet. Tell him the answer is still no. Then he was gone.
The four witnesses who would later speak, partially, reluctantly, in fragments, all described the same thing in the minutes after Bruce disappeared around that corner. Nobody moved. Not for a long time. The men on the ground stayed on the ground, not because they couldn't get up, but because standing felt presumptuous somehow, felt like a claim on normalcy that the situation hadn't yet granted them permission to make. The three who had dropped their weapons stood against the wall. The baton lay in the middle of the alley. The knife was still on the crate. One man, one of the ones who had dropped his weapon early, one of the ones who had made the honest decision, started to say something, some attempt at explanation or processing, some words to put around what had just happened. He stopped. There were no words for it. Not because the violence had been extreme. They were men who understood extreme violence, who had participated in it, who had delivered it and received it. That wasn't what silenced them. What silenced them was the precision. The specific, almost gentle precision of a man who could have done far more and chose not to, who took a knife not to use it, but to remove it, who struck 12 armed men in the dark and calibrated every single impact to incapacitate rather than destroy, who was in control, completely, from the first second to the last, not just of his own body, but of the entire situation, of the outcome, of the exact amount of damage this night would produce. That was not fighting. That was something else entirely. Big Dragon heard the report the following morning. The accounts differ on how he responded. Some say he was furious. Some say he was quiet in a way his associates found more unsettling than fury. What all accounts agree on is this: he did not send anyone else. The proposition was never raised again. Bruce Lee filmed Enter the Dragon. No one bothered him on the streets of Hong Kong. Not once. The story moved the way these stories move, in whispers, in backrooms, in the particular oral tradition of people who traffic in the currencies of danger and reputation. It traveled from Kowloon to Mong Kok to the film studios of Shaw Brothers, to the training halls where men who understood what they were hearing recognized the significance of the details. 12 men, armed, 45 seconds. And the knife on the crate. Always the knife on the crate. That specific detail that carried the story forward like a hook in a current. The detail that people returned to because it said more than all the other details combined. He didn't need it. A man who doesn't need the weapon he just took from you is a man operating in a register you don't have a response to. The footage, if any existed, was never released. No official record, no police report. Men like Big Dragon did not file police reports. No names attached to the story in any document that survived. Only the whispers. Only the four witnesses who told it slowly, reluctantly, in fragments, over decades. Only the silence of 12 men who came into an alley with certainty and left it with something they spent years trying to unknow.
People who study Bruce Lee, who study not the films but the man, the philosophy, the architecture of what he built inside himself over a lifetime, will tell you that the most misunderstood thing about him is this. He was not interested in winning fights. He was interested in the question underneath all fights, the question that every confrontation is really asking, stripped of its ego and its posturing and its weapons and its numbers. Who are you when everything else is removed? When size doesn't matter, when weapons don't matter, when numbers don't matter, When the story you've been telling yourself about what power looks like has been taken away. When you are standing in an alley at 11 o'clock at night, and the thing you prepared for is not working, and the man in front of you is not behaving the way men are supposed to behave. Who are you then? Bruce spent his entire life answering that question for himself, drilling it into his body until it was not philosophy anymore, not theory, not a quote on a poster, until it was reflex, until it was breath, until it was the thing that remained when everything else was gone. He called it being water. Not the poetry of it. People fixate on the poetry and miss the physics. Water is not passive. Water is the most persistent force in nature. Water does not fight the shape of things. It moves through them, around them, finds every gap, applies pressure to every weakness, and over time, it wins every single argument it enters. 12 armed men in a dark alley in Kowloon discovered the physics of this at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in 1971. Not the poetry, the physics. There is a version of this story where it ends with the fight, with the image of Bruce walking away, jacket straightened, men on the ground behind him, the knife on the crate. That is the cinematic version. But the real ending, the one that matters, is what happened inside those men afterward. Because violence lands on the body, and then it moves to the mind. And some of the men in that alley carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. Not the physical damage, that healed. The other thing, the thing that doesn't heal easily because you don't have a name for it and can't explain it to a doctor. The knowledge of what a human being can become if they are willing to commit to the work of becoming it. The knowledge that somewhere out in the world, in a frame that looked like any other man, 5'7", 140 pounds, was something that had no relationship to the ordinary logic of force and counterforce, threat and response, size and advantage. Something built through 20 years of obsession, through 10,000 hours of training that most people quit after 10, through a philosophy that refused the comfort of limitation, that said the body is only what you are willing to make it, that the mind is only what you are willing to discipline it into, that the man who says I cannot and the man who says there is no cannot are not operating in the same universe. Bruce Lee operated in a different universe. He just let 12 men visit it for 45 seconds. They checked out early. In 1973, 2 years after the alley, Bruce Lee died in Hong Kong at the age of 32. The world mourned loudly, the films, the legacy, the cultural seismic shift he'd produced by simply existing on a screen and being undeniably, electrifyingly what he was. The men in the alley mourned differently, or didn't mourn at all, or felt something more complicated than mourning, the particular grief of people who had been given a glimpse of what the outer edge of human potential looks like, and now had to live in a world where that edge was gone. The lieutenant, the former Thai boxer, the man with the chain, reportedly trained in martial arts for the rest of his life, not professionally, just privately, just relentlessly, just with the specific intensity of a man trying to understand something that happened to him in 20 seconds that he hadn't finished processing after 20 years. He never explained why. He didn't need to. 12 men walked into that alley believing that numbers were power, that weapons were advantage, that size was authority. 45 seconds later, they walked out knowing something different. Not just about Bruce Lee, about themselves, about the vast, uncomfortable distance between what most people are and what a person can become when they decide, truly decide, at the level of bone and blood and every waking hour, to refuse the ordinary. That is the real story. Not the fight, the refusal. The 20 years of 5 a.m. mornings and split knuckles and a mind that never stopped questioning, never stopped testing, never accepted the answer it was given when a better answer was possible. The fight lasted 45 seconds. The preparation lasted a lifetime. And when those 12 men looked up from the ground of that Kowloon alley, in the ringing silence after 140 pounds of absolute human precision had walked away into the Hong Kong night, they were not looking at a fighter. They were looking at the consequence of a life lived without excuses. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that size is not the measure of a man and speed is not only physical, hit subscribe. Because this channel exists for stories like this one, the ones they didn't put in the history books, the ones that survive only in whispers, the ones that are more true for being untold. Subscribe and stay close. The next story is already waiting.